So we finally reached the final lesson, lesson 11, culture in the present age, and we've come full circle. We're bringing Japanese history from 1941, when World War II begins for Japan, all the way until 2018, until the present day. So we're finally reached the end of the course. If you might remember, we left off in the middle of the Showa period last time, and the Japanese Empire is now involved in a major war with the Allied powers, the United States and Great Britain mostly. Japan has just attacked Pearl Harbor. They have just taken over all of the European colonies of the Pacific and Asia. So the French colonies, the British colonies, the American colonies, the Philippines, Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and other colonies, Indonesia, the Dutch colony of Indonesia, are all taken over by the Japanese. So, at the beginning of the war, because Japan conquered all of these colonies so quick, things were great, propaganda-wise. So, in Japan, on the home front, nationalistic writers, propaganda, the news, the radio, everyone was praising Japan's great success against the West. Okay, they said that the colonial powers are finally out of Asia. Right, Japan has driven out the British, the Americans, the Dutch, the French out of Asia, and now Japan is able to control the Asian continent for its own empire. And the Japanese propaganda machine turned this into something positive for Asians, okay, which was very odd, as you can see in this propaganda bit, with the Japanese kids leading the children from all the other Asian countries. And their goal was to create something called a Greater East Asia Crow Prosperity Sphere. Okay, what this basically means is Asia for the Asians. Okay, it states that all the countries in East and Southeast Asia can rule themselves without European or American or Western control. The Japanese are protecting them from the Western powers and allowing them to rule their countries by themselves. Is this true? Absolutely not. Okay, for all purposes, the Japanese were simply replacing one colonial overlord, whether it's the Americans, the British, or the French, or the Dutch, with their own colonial power. So Japan is just replacing these countries and taking over on their behalf, but they're doing a much more brutal job. Okay, as you can see here in China, the Japanese are forcing them to bow to the soldiers as they're walking, to the Japanese soldiers. The Chinese civilians have to bow to them. This reminds you of that picture we saw from the Edo period, right? When the samurai forced the farmers to bow to them as they were on the road. Remember that image on one of the PowerPoints in lesson 7? That's, again, the samurai mentality is still there for the military class, right? They've changed, they've modernized, but the mentality is still the same as the samurai, okay? So, even though Japan claimed that they were liberating these countries from the Western powers, in reality, it was a much more brutal occupation than under the previous regime. So initially, Japanese victories against the British and the Americans were widely reported. Everybody knew about them, that Pearl Harbor and taking over the colonies, and people were very proud of the great achievements of the military and the army and the navy, right? But one naval battle, the Battle of Midway in 1942, was the turning point for World War II. Okay, Japan was winning, 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 and then finally they suffered a very, very big defeat at the hands of the United States Navy during the Battle of Midway. Okay, this is an image of the Battle of Midway where the Japanese suffered a very, very major loss at the hands of the United States Navy. And the loss in the Battle of Midway was basically the beginning of the end for Japan in the war. Okay, oddly enough, because the Japanese military, the fascist government, controlled so much, basically all of the news and what information leaked out to the people, the Japanese people were lied to. They were told that the Battle of Midway was a Japanese victory, even though it was a big defeat, right? Because they didn't want people's morale to go down. So, whenever there was a loss at a battle, this was never reported back home. If you were a soldier on the front or in another country fighting, and you wrote a letter to your parents back home, you couldn't tell them that you were starving. You couldn't tell them that you lost a big battle. You couldn't tell them that, you had just lost something. You would have to tell them that we won, everything's perfect, we're creating a new great grand Japanese empire. So there was a lot of censorship in terms of what information was leaked to the Japanese public during the war. As the war continues in 1943 and 1944, General Douglas MacArthur leads the charge in basically leading the war against Japan, and he establishes the policy called island hopping. What island hopping means was, instead of focusing on an all-front war against Japan and dealing with 6 or 7 battles at once, the United States would focus on basically liberating one Pacific island at a time before hopping or moving on to the next one. So they would focus all their energy on one island, they would liberate that island from Japanese control, and then move on to the next island. So that way it was very systematic, it was very organized, and it basically gave the United States time to control new territory instead of just invading everything at the same time and resulting in a vast amount of loss of life. The Japanese strategy, on the other hand, was one of extreme desperation. And so they implemented the strategy of using suicide pilots, or kamikaze, to crash airplanes, their planes, into the American ships or naval carriers. And what this did is it caused a great amount of life, a loss of life, because if you're crashing your plane into a huge naval carrier, that's going to deal in a big piece of damage for the Americans, right? Of course, this is at the expense of actual human life, because you have these Japanese kamikaze pilots who are sacrificing their own lives for the war effort, okay? And that's why they use the term kamikaze, which you might remember was the term used for the typhoon that defended the country against the Mongol invasions back during the Kamakura period, right? And this was basically a tribute to that these young boys are going to be defending their country against the United States, the American invaders, and they'll give up their lives. They will be the new divine wind to wipe out the second group of invaders, because Japan has never been occupied or colonized before, right? So, they thought that the kamikaze is going to help again. So these young suicide pilots had to give their lives for the sake of the country, and it was a very prestigious position. It was not, it was viewed very, very highly in the Japanese military. And they essentially were told that you're sacrificing your lives for the emperor, for the state, for the land of the gods. And so by early 1945, all of the Pacific Islands have been liberated by the United States. The Philippines has been liberated by the United States. And now they have finally reached the Japanese islands. Okay, all the territory Japan won in the Pacific Ocean is now in American hands, because the Americans are winning thanks to this island hopping policy. And so they've reached the island chain of Okinawa. And Okinawa is very crucial because it's the last set of islands that Japan needs to conquer before they invade the main islands of Japan. Okay, and once they take over Okinawa, it's basically time to liberate Japan, to conquer Japan, right? After Okinawa, you've reached Kyushu already. Okay, so the Battle of Okinawa takes place in April 1945. The Battle of Okinawa was truly a destructive battle for several reasons. For one, the Japanese strategy was to never surrender. This is also derived from the samurai period, where surrender was considered to be the worst thing you could do, right? As a warrior, giving up means that you were also giving up your honor. So it was more honorable to die in battle or to commit suicide than to surrender yourself to the enemy, okay? And so the Japanese strategy from the get-go for both soldiers and civilians was to never surrender. So soldiers would often commit suicide before becoming a prisoner of war or surrendering territory. And this was also expanded to the civilian population of Okinawa, where they were forced, even civilians were forced to commit suicide before the enemy conquered Okinawa. So you have cases of caves where civilians were hiding, and soldiers who were hiding in there with them would often blow the entire cave up with a grenade and taking the civilians' lives with them so that no one surrenders to the Americans. And also, the Japanese civilians were taught that the Americans were going to rape and pillage, just as they had done in countries, the Japanese had done in countries they had conquered. So the Japanese thought that they were going to be treated the same way by the Americans that they had treated their subjugated peoples. So the Battle of Okinawa was truly destructive because the policy was never surrender. Okay, death was valued more than surrendering to the Americans. Finally, after a brutal battle, Okinawa fell to the Americans in May 1945. And what this meant was Douglas MacArthur and the American government knew that the next step after Okinawa was to conquer the main Japanese islands. And this was something that Everybody knew in the American government, the military, even the population, the civilian population of the United States, they knew that this was going to be truly destructive. If it took so long and such utter loss of life to conquer Okinawa, can you imagine how long it would take to conquer Kyushu, Honshu, etc.? And so Okinawa was occupied by the United States from 1945 all the way until 1972. It wasn't until 1972 that Okinawa was returned to Japan. As Japan continued losing more and more battles, and as the Battle of Okinawa ended, censorship and control became much more strict. If you were caught speaking out against the war or talking about surrender, you would be considered an enemy of the state, arrested, and maybe even executed. Because at this time, everything is under strict control of the military. And as the Americans got closer to the main islands, everyone was worried about this final showdown against the United States, and more men were drafted into the Japanese army. Even women, the elderly, children, they were also trained. They were given special training to fight to the death. They were told that if the Americans invade, you will take a bayonet and just kill as many of them as you can. And then if you lose, take your own life instead of surrendering to them. It's more honorable if you die for your country and you die for your emperor than surrender to the United States. So even school children were given training on how to kill American soldiers if and when they invaded Japan. The most tragic part of World War II for the Japanese were the horrific air raids that began in 1944. The Americans began systematically, sometimes on a daily basis, bombing Japanese cities. And I say Japanese society because it wasn't just bombing the cities. It was bombing civilians and people and their entire lives. And the sole purpose of the air raids was to bomb Japan into surrender. They thought it was a form of psychological warfare where people are just going to have enough and force their government to surrender if they've had enough of these air raids. And none of Japan's major cities escaped devastation. Tokyo is completely burned to the ground thanks to the firebombs. The city had been rebuilt after the Great Kanto earthquake 20 years before. It was completely destroyed now. Osaka is bombed. Osaka Castle is destroyed. Nagoya, Kobe, other major cities all over Japan are devastated. Kyoto was spared. Actually, Kyoto was one of the targets of the atomic bombing that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And a man in the American government who was well phased in Japanese history, he knew about Japanese culture and history. He told President Truman that if you bomb Kyoto, which has been the historic capital of Japan for over a millennium, for 1,000 years, bombing Kyoto, you will never earn the trust of the Japanese people. You will forget it. They will never like you. They will never like the Americans, and we will be their enemy forever. It's like bombing Rome or Athens, ancient cities that have such significance for Western civilization. Bombing Kyoto will have the same impact for Japan. And so Kyoto was spared. That's why it was not bombed by the Americans. Some industrial parts of the city were, but the historical areas were left untouched, thanks to that one gentleman. But in the other major cities, thousands would die in just one night of bombing because they were fire bombs. So they would, not only would they bomb, fires would spread through the city. So it was truly destructive. Napalm bombs were also used by the Americans in the cities of Tokyo and Osaka, and these created huge firestorms that would burn square miles in just seconds, and the population was completely terrorized. These were done to force the Japanese government to surrender, but Japanese propaganda states that no matter what happens, Japan will survive the war, and that it's the divine land of the kami, emperor is a god, and that the Japanese will fight to the death. So even though they're dealing with all these firebombs, the Japanese society knows that surrender is not an option because that's what they've been told all these years. And even after Germany and Italy were defeated by the Allies, Japan refuses to surrender. While this is all happening in Japan, in the United States, there was a very, very sizable Japanese American population, especially in California. And by 1941, the majority of Japanese Americans were second generation, which means their parents had been born in Japan. They were born here in the United States. They didn't speak Japanese, many of them. They were Americans. They were American citizens. And they were completely assimilated into American culture. Most of them didn't really know much about Japan. Okay? But in the year 1942, President Roosevelt issues something called an ultimatum, which he states that for security reasons, all Japanese Americans on the West Coast need to leave their homes, leave everything they know behind, and basically move to a series of concentration camps in Western states. So some in Arizona, some in California, some in Utah, which were built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. So essentially, you had to leave everything behind that you knew, your homes, your property, your jobs, your loved ones, and move to these camps for safety reasons, because they were not sure whether or not these Japanese Americans would have the American government's back if the Japanese were ever to invade the West Coast. So at the end of the day, 119,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, they're not Japanese, they're American citizens, were forced into these camps. And they're not death camps. You cannot compare them to the death camps that Nazi Germany operated in Europe. But they are concentration camps in that a small amount of people are concentrated into one area and they're forced to live there against their will. Living conditions were very, very harsh because most of the Japanese Americans were from the city. They were not used to country life. They were not used to the desert winds or the harsh living conditions of living in the mountains. So it was very difficult for them to live in these very, very small barracks. And if you go to the Japanese American National Museum for your extra credit, you will see one such example of a reconstructed barrack of what it looked like living in one of the camps. You can see it in this picture here. Oftentimes, entire families would be sandwiched into these small quarters. And these are a list of the 10 camps. You can see that most of them are in the western states, Arizona, California. Some are in Arkansas, quite inland. And they all house over 1,000 people. The biggest ones were in Arizona, 20,000. The one we have here in California is Manzanar, 10,000. It's basically near the city of Bishop. If you've ever been to Mammoth Lakes, it's off of Highway 395. You can go to Manzanar. 10,000 Japanese Americans were housed there, mostly from LA, California, although a lot of LA Japanese were also moved to Arizona, Tule Lake and Gila River. These were the harshest camps. But, there were no armed resistance in the camps. The majority of Japanese Americans remained loyal to the United States. Some were even allowed, after the war began, some even tried to enlist into the army, the United States Army, and the Army never sent them to Japan until very late in the war. In the beginning, they were only sent to Europe. So the Japanese were sent to Europe to fight. There was a small group of Japanese American, a regiment of Japanese American troops. They were sent to Europe, to Germany, to fight against the Nazis. And it's very sad because even though they were fighting and dying for their country had housed their parents and loved ones in these camps. And it's very, very sad because, this is a dark period in our history. And, through it all, I have a family friend, who's now deceased, but she was in Manzanar, and she says that her father, on the night before they had to leave for camp, the father said to his daughter, who was an American, who was born in America. The father was born in Japan and had immigrated here. He told his daughter that, no matter what happens, I do not regret coming to America, because without coming to America, if we hadn't come to America, I would not have been able to guarantee that all my children have an education and can grow up free. And it's ironic that he said that he was so thankful to this country even after what happened to them. So it's very, very a sad period in our country's history. And after the war, in 1945, the Japanese Americans were allowed to return to their homes and businesses. Sometimes, if they had a nice neighbor, they would have kept their belongings for them, or the house deed would have been signed under their name. But, it was not until the 70s, I believe, under President Gerald Ford, that the United States officially apologized to the survivors of these camps and compensated them financially.